Well, this is what it looks like to get a drubbing on an election night. I'm in Sheffield, Nick Clegg's hometown now. He's the local MP. This is a city where the battle is between the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party. It's not a coalition fight here. There's very few Tories down there on the hall. And the people of Sheffield are pretty unhappy at what's happened over the last year. They don't really like the coalition, and tonight I think they're really out to get a bit of revenge.
I know the people in Sheffield see that the Lib Dems sold out. They don't think they're standing up for Sheffield whatsoever. And they believe that, especially Nick Clegg, has betrayed the city. And he's a Tory lapdog, to be truthful.
It's mainly the Tories manifesto that is being, that is dominating the coalition.
If they can take that, they'll be having a good...
Well, it turned out that the Lib Dems did get a pasting in Sheffield, and almost everywhere else too. Electoral reform was killed off. Meanwhile, the Tories did unexpectedly well. So is it curtains for the coalition? But when David Cameron and Nick Clegg reached a deal a year ago, I was optimistic. I still am. I've argued in The Guardian that this was more than a Lib Dems sellout or just a Tory government. Well, lots of people who read those pieces disagreed, and the comments have been furious.
Pull the other one, Julian. Virtually all of your articles could be construed as right-wing Tory propaganda.
Or, more direct still,
why read Julian Glover when you can read Richard Littlejohn? Or why read either when you can have a better time smashing oneself in the groin with a claw hammer?
and there's a lot more like that. Over the last year we've had cuts, more cuts, tuition fees, backtracking on forests and this week's disability protests. That sunny day in May, a year ago, when David Cameron and Nick Clegg seemed to fall in love in the Downing Street garden, is far off now.
Our Liberal Conservative government will take Britain in a historic new direction. A direction of hope and unity, conviction and common purpose.
It looked so sweet back then, but has the coalition helped or hindered Cameron's vision?
I think Nick Clegg's claim was that by having Liberal Democrats in the coalition with the Conservatives, that would drag the government towards the centre, it would make it more progressive, it would moderate David Cameron and George Osborne's instincts. And I actually think that probably history will show its work the other way around. In my view, on the pace of spending cuts, on NHS reform, on disability benefit cuts, they've done things in the name of the coalition which they would never have dared do if this was just a Conservative government. People would have said the same old Tories. It's a great irony, but Nick Clegg's probably pushed the government to the right.
And unexpectedly, Greg Clark, top new Tory thinker and local government minister, doesn't wholly disagree.
I think, say, if we'd had a majority of 5 or 10, then actually some of the economic reforms, for example, some of the restructuring of public services that we've been engaged in, might actually have been more tentative than having the majority that we do have, where we can accommodate people who simply can't support the policy of the government.
Have you heard people talk about the big society and they say it's a great idea for the future of the country? What do you think?
It's a gimmick, it's a soundbite. It's the same, these politicians, they do it every single election, every single year. It's a soundbite and I think they baffle people.
Well, one man who should know what it's about is Jesse Norman. He wrote a book arguing that the state forgot the way people actually live and interact. He wants a more diverse and creative society, but the public on the whole have found it hard to fathom.
I think it's rather a badge of honour that you can't explain it. I can't think of any great philosophies you could explain in 2 words or 3 words. It's a kind of media fixation to regard everything as a matter of communication. But there is something, I think, new here, and thoughtful people on the left see it's new and they're trying to respond to it. And that's the really interesting shape of the argument to come, I think.
So this is a kind of structure for politics and society that isn't just about party divides. You think the left could be part of the big society too?
Oh, I absolutely think it can. And as an idea, it doesn't actually have a completely left or right political orientation at all. Localism is really a way of getting away from the state. But at the same time, some of the legislation we've seen, I think, on schools and other areas like that is an attempt to enfranchise all those institutions that sit between the individual and big government.
Well, that's the theory. What about the practice? I've come 400 miles north from London up to Cumbria, constituency of Rory Stewart, a new Tory MP. It's a very rural place, lots of sheep, lots of hedges, very few people. He says this is really where the big society is happening.
What we're seeing is communities getting involved in doing renewable energy, so they do water schemes and solar power. See people doing quite ambitious things like building big affordable housing projects. And probably most ambitious of all is rural broadband, where we're seeing communities driving fibre optic cables much deeper and further than they would be able to under the old system.
Rory took me on a whirlwind tour of some of these projects, which ranged from this community group, who got a big society grant for solar panels, to the conversion of a school into a community centre. We hear from David Cameron and Nick Clegg and people in Westminster, and they talk this sort of airy-fairy language about community empowerment. Has it meant something here?
Definitely, and this building really kind of encompasses that empowerment, because the steering group very much still have control of what they created, but this is a county council facility. It's owned by the county council, but there's still some control about what happens in there from the steering group. As we come together, we become one voice and we become a much louder voice.
Further on, in Crosby Ravensworth, I met people who've been involved in a cooperative to buy the local pub and are also spearheading the building of local houses. But how has the coalition made any difference to schemes like these?
Certainly with the housing scheme, some of the barriers we were coming up against, the sort of bureaucratic barriers, the complexities of some of the legal agreements, etc., were fairly technical and quite major blockages to our project. The big society involvement and Department of Communities and Local Government has actually helped to unlock some of those. And I know work is continuing to actually simplify procedures with the Homes and Communities Agency, for example, to make it easier for community land trusts.
It's a bit of a fantasy to think what's happening here could happen in Liverpool or in London.
Julian, one of the interesting things is when I began doing this a year and a half ago, people said it was a fantasy to think we could even do it here. My general experience is that people underestimate communities. And one of the useful things about the big society banner is it allows us to get people together and to get things done. And it's not primarily about money, it's primarily about understanding that local communities know more, care more, can do more, and should be given resources to do it.
I know these seem small schemes, some of which might have happened anyway, but I think they represent larger ideas too, people trying to do things for themselves. I think on the power of the central state, Lib Dems and Conservatives agree more than they might like to admit.
We want to see a welfare system which has more power in the hands of the practitioner, less in the bureaucrats. I think we want to see a social system in Britain that gives people opportunity. I think we want to see power shift, both of us, from the state to the locality and the community. It's not talking about a smaller state, but it's talking about a state whose power lives in different places.
At the beginning, you've got to admit, there was a bit of a fling, if not full marriage, and a few people did begin to fall in love. Is that over?
Yeah, no, my view, it probably is. I think it's over because of the AV referendum. I always said that the referendum itself will never affect the coalition, but the way it was fought will, and this is going to happen. I think there's less of that congeniality. There's less of that trust, much less of that trust. I think that some of that trust has not been honoured in the way that this has been fought. So I think this becomes far more a business relationship than an emotional relationship. Is it perfect? No. Is it one of our governments? No. But are we showing we still have a heart and the campaigning ability to do things which are on the progressive wing of politics? Yes, it is.
I think it's a maturing of the relationship actually to be comfortable about recognising that we do come from different political traditions. We are different parties. But I don't the sense of the rose garden. I mean, the aesthetics may look different in that sharp words have been exchanged a bit over recent weeks on occasion, but actually in terms of relationships, they're really cordial.
Well, maybe. Lots of Lib Dems would disagree, and certainly the mood's changed for the worst. But I think at its best, this government's still held together by a common idea. Localism, empowerment, devolution. These can sound like empty phrases, but I think at their best, they do represent a real shift from the way the government's been carried out over the last 50 years. Lots of people, lots of Guardian readers, see the coalition only through the prism of cuts. Well, I disagree. It's got 4 more years to prove its point.